Welcome to the week on the prophets in the Old Testament. I just wonder, when I say the word prophets, what comes to mind. I know when I was growing up and I first started my journey in Christianity, I assumed that a prophet was a fortune teller, someone who could predict the future. But as I've been journeying with the prophets and studying some of the Old Testament, I've realized that the original word for prophets was not only fortune teller, it was a truth teller. A prophet was someone who stood in between the gap of the people and God. And so they were almost God's translators, the ones that spoke God's message into the situations of the day. And so a prophet was very in touch with what was happening in the world and their place, but they were also very in touch with what God was saying to them about those situations. And then as a prophet, their job was to then tell the people the message of God in different ways. And some of the prophets did it through acting it out. Some of it did it through their lifestyles. Other prophets did it through their messages, others through writing. Every prophet had a different way of telling God's story and God's message in the situation in which the people found themselves. I remember growing up, my mom had a few slogans that she used to say. And the first one was that a mother knows everything. The second one was somebody's going to get hurt. I remember when I was in matric, my brother and I started an epic war between the two of us. Actually, he started it, let me just get it out there. He pinned me down while I was studying for science, matric exam. He pinned me down and colored my face in with permanent marker. That started a war of epic proportions between my brother and I. And we were throwing each other with oil and flour and syrup, and I can't even tell you what. My mom had gone out, and she had said to us, when she saw all of this starting, she said to us, somebody's going to get hurt. As teenagers, we thought we knew better and carried on what we were doing, until eventually what stopped it was that my brother's friend accidentally headbutted me and broke my nose. I had to phone my mom, and she had to come and take me to the hospital so that they could fix my nose. But there was my mom saying, you better stop it, somebody's going to get hurt. Now, that doesn't mean my mom was able to predict the future. She wasn't a fortune teller. But what my mom was able to do is she knew what was happening, and what she knew by our actions, what a possible consequence was going to be. Now, prophet was the same, not quite the same, but they had a closer relationship to God. And so they would watch what the people were doing. They would listen to what God is saying, and they would often say to the people, if you don't stop, somebody's going to get hurt. And that's what the prophets did. The amazing thing about the prophets is that not only would they say those things, but they would also tell the truth of who God is. And that truth is true even today. And so what's amazing about these prophets is sometimes they told God's truth in that situation, and because it's God's truth and God is eternal, that truth was true even for generations to come, and even down to today's age now. What we're going to do today is just briefly look at some of the prophetic writings. I'm going to describe the difference between the major prophets, the minor prophets. I'd look at some of the major prophets and when they wrote and what they were saying, why they wrote. Then the minor prophets, I'd like to just group them into different stages in which they wrote and unpack that a little bit. Everything is in the notes though, so I know that offhand I'm not going to remember all the names of the prophets, let alone pronounce them correctly. And then what we do is I would just like to share one reading from Isaiah to illustrate what I'm trying to say. And so to start, we have two different categories of prophets. We have the major prophets and the minor prophets. Now, the major prophets, it didn't mean that they were more important. It didn't mean that they were more legit. It just meant that their prophecies, their books that were written, were longer than the others. Generally, it meant that those prophecies, those prophetic books, took up more than one scroll. The major prophets were Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, and Daniel. That's how we have it classified in our Old Testament. Now, Daniel is a different story, and one day I would love us to look at the apocryphy writings, the apocalyptic writings, which is Daniel and Revelation. And that would be a whole other story. So as I speak of the prophets, although Daniel is part of it, we won't be touching too much on Daniel today. And so we have those as our major prophets. The minor prophets are those that are left. There are 12 of them. It's Jonah, Hosea, Haggai, Habakkuk, all those people. There's 12 of them. If you just go look it up in your notes or in the Bible, you'll see who I'm speaking about. And so if we could briefly look at the major prophets, starting with Isaiah. Now, Isaiah is interesting, and there's something we need to understand about the time, is that today, when we write things today, you write it in your own name. If you use somebody else's name, today it's considered plagiarism. In those days, it was the opposite, and the New Testament, we'll look at that in the next semester, but in those days, it was the opposite. If you studied under someone, so if you were considered somebody's disciple, if you studied their school of thought or journeyed with them, and then you wrote something down, you wrote it in that person's name to give credit to their thoughts. And so as we read Isaiah, you'll see that Isaiah happens not in one generation, not in one historical situation, but over 3 different historical situations. And that means that you probably find more than one person from the school of Isaiah actually wrote Isaiah. You see, Isaiah starts right at the beginning, and I think it's chapter 1 through to chapter 39. That is all about Jerusalem before the exile. It's all about Jerusalem before the exile. So what happens is Isaiah is involved in Jerusalem. He seems to be quite close to the royal priesthood, the royal family. There's a chance that he might have been in the priestly situation or among the priests. And Isaiah speaks to the people before the exile, warning them about what is to come. He challenges them. He tells them that if we carry on like this, somebody's going to get hurt. He starts telling them that there's going to be destruction. The next section goes on in Isaiah, and it's the section during the exile. And that was, suddenly the message of Isaiah is still similar, but it changes, and it starts offering hope about how God hasn't forgotten them, and there will be a reason for their suffering, and God will use even their suffering to bring about good. And so now you see that Isaiah is warning them, saying somebody is going to get hurt. Then when they do get hurt, Isaiah comforts them. It's very much like he is representing this divine parent. The same as my mom, who was saying somebody's going to get hurt, and then when I did get hurt, although she wanted to say I told you so, she did offer comfort and go, don't worry, everything's going to be okay, and took me to the hospital. And that's what we see in Isaiah. We also see it in Jeremiah. He also wrote at the beginning of the exile and then during the exile. But Isaiah's book carries on, that he gives comfort during the exile, and then he goes all the way. The next section is after the exile. Is this when they start rebuilding? And he starts saying how they need to rebuild, and they need to focus on their worship of God and their social justice. And so Isaiah was really ministering to the people in that time. Isaiah was among the people that got taken to Babylon. And so when he spoke to the exiles, he was speaking to the people in exile that were living in Babylon. Jeremiah, who's one of the other major prophets, Jeremiah also was speaking to the people before exile and after exile, but Jeremiah was a lot more straightforward. Jeremiah is beautiful because we see so much of his story. We see some of the things that happened to him. We see his thoughts. We see the situation of the day when we read it. And Jeremiah really challenged the leadership of Jerusalem. The kings, the priests, he he didn't hold back. He called them on everything. He told them exactly what he thought without holding back any punches. And because of it, Jeremiah was very, very, very unpopular. Jeremiah, what's amazing about his way is that he was saying to the people that politically they're making the wrong move. So what was happening is that Babylon was rising to power, and so was Egypt. And the people in Jerusalem, the Judeans, the king there, decided to side with the Egyptians and rebel against the Babylonians. And Jeremiah was saying, this isn't what God wants you to do. God wants you to humble yourself. God wants us to submit to the Babylonians. It's about worship, not about power. And he challenges it all the time. But the priests and the other prophets, the false prophets, they wanted to have favor with the king. And so they were saying the opposite to Jeremiah and saying, yes, we must stand up and, God will save us because he lives in Jerusalem and we have the temple and we worship Yahweh. And so the king is right. And they were supporting that. And so Jeremiah was speaking against the king and the prophets and the priests. He was almost put to death because they considered him a traitor. And then the exile happened exactly as Jeremiah had said. He had said to them, this is what's going to happen. We will be destroyed. All of these things. And that's what happened. Jeremiah was then taken through to Egypt. There was a group of people that took him with, and he ended up in Egypt during the exile. The next writing is Lamentations. Now, Lamentations for me is weird because it's not the same as the other prophetic books. It's actually just a collection of poems. And it's a collection of poems during the exile, and it's amazing to see how absolutely raw and vulnerable they are. They just describe beautifully what was happening during the exile. And so it's all raw emotion. It's saying exactly how they felt. So if you want to know what it was like to live in the exile, then the poems of Lamentations is brilliant. And finally, Ezekiel. Ezekiel is considered the greatest exilic prophet. So he wrote it during the exile, and it was very much the one prophet that tells us the most about the exile. Ezekiel takes us through this journey of what it was like, and I think he was one of the first to be taken out into exile. And he starts telling people just before the destruction, he starts saying, we will be destroyed. This is what's going to happen. And people were still hopeful and saying like, no, there's a chance we will survive. There's a chance that we won't be destroyed as Jerusalem. And he kept saying, no, we are going to be destroyed. And then once again, when the destruction happened, then he starts offering hope. And as people, we can almost see this direct line, as people grow in hopelessness, because the exile is going longer and longer and longer, Ezekiel grows in hope. And he gives more and more promises of what is to come. Eventually, Ezekiel actually ends with this image of a new earth, a new world, a new way of worship, a new temple, saying like that's what we need to look forward to. And he says that then the temple will be at the center, that people will have equal land distribution, that everything will be fair, that it won't be based on politics but on worship. And he paints this picture of hope all the time as the exile goes on longer and longer. And then finally, Daniel. And like I say, Daniel is a book that we'll deal with completely on its own. I would consider it more apocalyptic writing, which is also prophetic, but it's a very specific type of prophetic writing. And I just pray, just bear with me, because we will pick that up in a different section when we deal with apocalyptic writing. And so that's a broad overview of the major prophets. Each one of those, like I say, we could do a module on each one. We could study each one for our whole lives because they are so deep, so rich, so insightful. And I just love the way that there was the warning, and when destruction happened, it turned into hope. And it speaks to me about the heart of God, how God was trying to stop people from being destroyed, how God didn't want the destruction to happen, how he was saying, change your ways, make a different decision, live differently, humble yourself. Don't be like this, because if you do, something is going to go wrong. And it's like God didn't want that to happen. And so he warns them through his prophets over and over. But when they did not listen and things went wrong, love how the message changes to one of comfort, of great comfort and absolute hope. It was I'd just like to read Isaiah 53, because when I speak about this idea that the prophets were speaking into their truth at that stage, but it also is truth for all time, one of the most clear ones is the servant prophecies, or the servant poems that Isaiah uses in the back end from about Isaiah 53. And this is what it says. And he's speaking both about Jerusalem and the Judeans at that stage, saying that their suffering will not be in vain, that God will use it. But he's also talking about the Messiah. And listen to this. Listen to how true this sounds to who Jesus is. Isaiah 53 from verse 7. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away, and who can speak of his descendants? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people he was stricken. He was assigned a grave with the wicked, and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life a guilt offering, he will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After the suffering of his soul, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. Therefore I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong, because he poured out his life unto death, and was numbered with the transgressors. For he bore the sin of many, and made the intercession for the transgressors. Do you hear how that is speaking a truth into the suffering of that time, how they were taken away, how they were among the rich, but also among the sinful, how they were carrying the sin, but how there's this promise of what is to come. So it's speaking of Israel, but you see how much it's speaking of Jesus. Just that through that suffering, God will bring about hope. And that's what the prophets do, is the prophets speak God's truth in that situation, but it ends up being God's truth in the future and even in our situations as well. And so that's a brief overview of the major prophets. And the minor prophets, I just encourage you to go and read each one of them. Just find out something about the prophets and the writings, and then go read those books. They are so fascinating. But I've divided them in the notes in the different categories of when most of them were written. And so there were some that were written to the northern kingdom, some that was before they were destroyed by the Assyrians. There were some that was written to the southern kingdom before they were destroyed by the Babylonians. There were some that were written during the exile. A majority of the exilic writings actually became major prophets, and I think only one was a minor prophet. And then there was the time after the exile, during the Persian period, when they were trying to rebuild. And each one of those stages in history, the prophets give a different message to the people because of the situations they faced. So, for example, in the northern kingdom, what was happening is just before they were destroyed, the northern kingdom was actually doing well. As a kingdom, they were wealthy, they were well off, they were rich. The problem is that they were arrogant. They had a strong military, they had a strong political power, they were well off as a country, as a nation. But socially, they weren't very well off. The rich were getting richer and richer and richer, and the poor were getting poorer and poorer and poorer. And the gap between rich and poor was becoming tremendous. It sounds a lot like South Africa today. And so that was one of the things that the prophets started to challenge, is they start saying, like, we are not doing our people well. We are not being just, and God doesn't like it. The other thing is that they were often challenging the way of worship, because what was happening is in Jerusalem they had a very strong temple religion, because they had the temple, they had Jerusalem, they had all of those things, but in the northern tribes they didn't. And so the northern kingdom, they did worship Yahweh, they did worship God, but they also worshipped Baal because of the amount of people, the Canaanites in that region, that worshipped Baal. Now, Baal was actually considered the fertility god, the god of the land, the god that would help with the crops and help them with agriculture. And so often these Israelites would turn to the worship of Baal. Just out of interest, as an aside, one of my favorite prophetic books is Hosea. And Hosea is that beautiful illustration of how he marries an unfaithful wife, and then she runs away and he buys her back. And just out of fascination is that was written in the northern kingdom, where they had this issue with the Baal worshippers. And in the northern kingdom, the word Baal literally meant husband. And so God, through Hosea and the act of his life, basically says to the Israelites, I am your true husband. And even when you're unfaithful and run off with other husbands, the Baals, I will buy you back and you will be mine. So you see, when we understand something of what was going on, those prophetic books just come alive. Those were the situations of the northern kingdom. The southern kingdom was really this warning of what is to come because they're following the wrong path, this warning of what is to come because they're growing in arrogance, this warning that simply having God live in Jerusalem is not going to be enough to save them. The exilic writings I've touched on, what's amazing there is that minor prophet who wrote during the exilic times, it's in the notes, he was one of the only prophets that actually stayed behind in Jerusalem. So his prophetic work is not from the perspective of those who were taken away. His prophetic work is from the perspective of the one who was left behind. So it's beautiful to read that. And then finally, the last group were the ones post-exile. Those who are writing post-exile, we can imagine that what they were challenged with a whole bunch of different issues, but one of the things that challenged them is this idea of building something new and all the challenges that came with it. And we've touched a lot on that in the historic writings. And so this is just a brief overview of the prophetic writings. And I truly hope that as you engage with it, they would come alive.